Hey Saints, just wanted to do a quick video here, kind of a follow-up on several of the different videos I've done in terms of the book of Revelation. Um, in Revelation chapter 6, in the fourth seal, the one thing that, kind of I tracked down was the beasts of the field in that verse here in the King James. And if you look in the Strong's, it's Therion. And just using good biblical hermeneutics, if you just search on Therion in the book of Revelation, you see that Therion, these beasts, are the descriptive term for in Revelation 13 for the Antichrist and for the false prophet, if that's the proper interpretation. But those two beasts that rise up out of the sea and out of the earth are Therion. It's also used in, I think it was chapter 11, for the demonic that rises up out of the abyss or the heart of the earth or whatever. And so, what we get into with that then is that fourth seal. There's a great war, and it says people are killed with, war, with death, and then, famine, and then with beasts of the field, Therion. And trying to make sense of that, what is demonic and yet what is at least partially human, because if that's what the Antichrist is and the false prophet, it's some mix of human and demonic. And that kind of throws you back then and makes you, I believe, take a look at the Nephilim from the Old Testament and other videos I've done that are in agreement with and based on stuff that different authors that actually Tom Horn's publishing group has sponsored over time, that talk about that full circle, that things that are in the beginning of the Bible come full circle at the end of the Bible. And one of the full circle items is the Nimrod of the original Tower of Babel is at least in part a picture of the Antichrist of the end days. And so, I speculated there that if the Antichrist is in some way Nimrod of old, it wasn't much of a shock to see that in Seal 4 there we have the rest of the Nephilim in the army, the Nephilim army, coming up out of the abyss. And I think the picture is painted best in Joel 1 through 3 from the Old Testament. He envisions a great army, and he's put the setting just in the day of the Lord, or just before the day of the Lord. It's at hand, I think is the way he says it in Joel 1. And then you see, I believe it's two different battles being described, the one in Joel 2, which has so much parallel language to the Gog and Magog war, Ezekiel 38-39. And then Joel 3 appears to be talking about Armageddon and sort of the post-Armageddon scenario where the army is finally put down. And so, connecting all these ideas together, I had the end times army being at least led by or in part Nephilim. And Joel 2 talks about that they march in organized fashion, and they climb over walls and into windows, and if they fall on a sword, they're not hurt. And so, they're super soldiers of some sort, genetic tampering, just like the Nephilim of old, fallen angel mating with women, producing the giants. And so those parallels are all there, and the reason why I put it into Seal 4 is because the Therion are first discussed there, and it's a great war defined in that chapter. And so you see how these things kind of line up, that I speculate that seal 4 is the war of Gog and Magog. It's just before the day of the Lord, which is, I think the technical start of the day of the Lord is in seal 6 of the book of Revelation, because it actually says the day has come, who can stand? And so I think, with Joel saying, this army appears just before the day of the Lord, seal 4 is just before seal 6. I think all these things line up. But yet I knew that teaching is a little bit tenuous. There's not many out there talking about it that way. I was pretty excited when Bill Salas put out his latest book talking about the gap between the rapture of the church and the day of the Lord. And he argues based on seal 5, the saints under the altar, saying, how long until you judge the blood that's been spilt there? And his argument is the day of the Lord couldn't have started by seal 5, because the souls under the altar wouldn't be asking God how long until his judgment comes, because if the day of the Lord had already begun, that would be his judgment. And so it's pretty simple rationale, but all of that puts these things in order. The rapture of the church being depicted in Revelation 4, and the elders in heaven being a picture of the saints in heaven. Then in Revelation 6, seal 1, the Antichrist comes. Seal 2 is a great war again, rider on the red horse with a great sword. And I personally think that lines up with many of the items of the Psalm 83 war in the Isaiah destruction of Damascus chapter, and then I think when you get to seal 4, a great war is again demonstrated, but here we have the Therion, and I speculate then that is the war, the first war that prophet Joel sees, and the armies are, genetically hybrid armies. So that's kind of where I went with all that. And so, given that the only backing to that thought, was a little bit of Bill Salas and some historical publishing that was done by Tom Horn's publishing organization, I really liked running into this reversing Hermon from Dr. Michael Heiser, because now he's taking a look at Second Temple Judaism, time of Christ and just before, and he's talking about how they might have viewed the teaching that John was given for the book of Revelation, and boom, he lays down a very similar scenario, and he's doing it because the fall of man in Genesis 3 wasn't the only sin that Christ has to rectify. It's also the fall of the angels mating with human women and corrupting the earth with both the giants of the earth and with the special knowledge, the fire from heaven that they gave. And so I'll show you, whatever it is here, a 10-minute clip of reversing Hermon, and I'll leave the link of this teaching at the bottom of this video. But I think I'll edify a lot of you that followed some of that teaching I was doing, and the reason why I was doing it is just kind of piling on now that there's good Second Temple time period teaching that would sort of line up with this whole thought, which kind of edifies me as I go about doing these videos. So God bless, saints.
Okay, well, I'm doing pretty well. In the book of Revelation, I have 2 chapters here that go through Revelation, and again, just pick out maybe 3 or 4 items that specifically link back to the Watcher story. The one chapter is about, again, this transgression of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the Antichrist. Now, what I do in this chapter, just going to give you a sweeping overview here, is I summarize the Second Temple Jewish profile of what they expected as from a Messiah. And also, in turn, what they expected about the great messianic enemy Because in their mind, there's Messiah, okay? He's going to come at the end of days and all this stuff. He's going to get rid of the oppression. Well, he has an enemy. So to a Jew, what did that enemy look like? How do they think about it? Again, this great messianic enemy. There are certain things about the enemy's profile that in Jewish texts, again, of this period, were linked to certain figures in Jewish demonology. One of the main ones is Belial. It's also spelled as Beliar in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The belief was that the great enemy of the Messiah, catch the reasoning, since the Messiah was the Son of God, the Son of the Most High, again, this divine Davidic figure, therefore there were Jews who speculated that his enemy would also either be the incarnation of or under the control of Belial, who was one of the Dead Sea Scroll terms for Satan. There were also, though, other Jews who thought, well, okay, it could be like an incarnation of Satan or something like that. And that's very familiar to us, the way, sort of Antichrist thinking is popularized. That's the normal one, again, for our day and age. But there are other texts that thought, well, no, wait a minute. Maybe it's not the incarnation of Satan himself. Maybe it's the incarnation of one of the fallen watchers. Because there are certain ways that the great enemy is described that link back into the Greek story, classical Greek story of the Titans, which again, if you're familiar with the story of the Titans, and I go through this in the chapter, there are very explicit connections between the Greek Titan story and the Book of Enoch and Genesis 6 language, and just general giant language in the Old Testament transmitted through the Septuagint. One of the ones that I talk about is Belos. This is actually a description from it's either Philo or a text called Eupolemus. He talks about Belos, who was a giant, who was the son of Kronos. Again, if you know anything about the Titans, Kronos is an important Titan, who gets linked, he gets described as the person who built Babylon and the Tower of Babel. And then other Jewish texts link Belos specifically with Nimrod. And so again, here's how I'm asking you to look at this stuff. Again, I'm not presenting this as, oh, this should be our theology of Antichrist now. What I'm saying is that if you were living in the first century and you were having a conversation with a literate Second Temple Jew and you were talking about the Antichrist, this is going to be part of his conversation. This is how he's going to perceive this great enemy. And there are parts of it that you can trace into the church fathers. By the way, in that chapter on depravity, Irenaeus and Tyler Stewart would be buddies, because Irenaeus also traced human depravity back to Genesis 6, not just Genesis 3. And again, he's a famous church father. But Irenaeus also tracked on this. He refers to, when he's discussing 666 in his comments about that passage in Revelation 13, he gives a couple speculations for what the number might mean. One of them is Teitan. Teitan by gematria equates out, spells out in numbers 666. Teitan was one of the words for the Titans. And again, he's getting this from his acquaintance with Second Temple Jewish material. And he goes into the Titan story himself. So Irenaeus is a famous church father that very evidently had taken the time to read lots of this stuff, had probably lots of conversations with Jews or Jewish converts. And again, that helped him look at the Old Testament, look at certain things, even in the New Testament, in a different way. And so Irenaeus is an important figure for this whole discussion, because he's a good indication that Mike isn't just making this stuff up. Okay, he's a good indication that Mike is observing what Irenaeus thought and saying, hey, that's kind of interesting. Where did he get that? Where did he come up with that? And you can, again, trace the series of thoughts back in the primary texts. The second chapter of this section is about different things in the book of Revelation. Revelation 9 I talk about because it has very, very explicit imagery to the release of the Watchers. Again, connecting that this is the release of the guys from the pit, from the abyss. And there are things in the passage that link back into Enochian material. The 144,000 is kind of interesting. I personally would still put this, I'd need to see more on it. I'd still sort of file this as in Mike's head, sort of speculative, but I put it in the book. There's an article by a guy who, it's actually two people, who published in a journal from South Africa. And it's a very long article, it's very detailed, but here's their view. They pick up on, when the 144,000 are described, they are described as being virgins who have not defiled themselves with women. And you think, well, who cares? So what? I mean, it was okay to get married in the Old and New Testament. Big deal. Well, what they try to demonstrate, and I think, again, they present what I'd call a reasonable circumstantial case for it. At least that's my thinking now. There are certain things in the description in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14 about the 144,000 that link back to Levitical language, the way priests were described. And we know priests were allowed to marry. So the question for them then becomes, why this statement? He believes that the 144,000 are people selected by God to, he doesn't believe they're just humans. Okay, they sort of waffle there because they differentiate them from the souls that are martyred under the throne and whatnot. But he thinks they are deliberately there to be representatives of God, and they are presented as, pure in terms of these are heavenly ones who have not defiled themselves with women. In other words, they are the counterparts to the Watchers who just got released. And so they are part of this cosmic Armageddon conflict, the war between gods and men. Okay. Again, I think they build a good circumstantial case for it. I'm not completely persuaded of it yet. But I thought it was worth putting in. The Antichrist from Dan tradition. This is also the 144,000. Oh, there's 12,000 from every tribe. What could be simpler? Yeah, until you count the tribes. Until you actually look at the tribes that are missing. Okay. Okay, there's Ephraim. There's a deal with Ephraim and Manasseh going on there, but the one that's omitted totally is Dan. And so you have this. You have a pretty long church history tradition that the Antichrist would descend from the tribe of Dan. Okay, I don't believe that the point is the tribe of Dan. I think the point is the region of Dan, which is in Bashan. Same name. Okay, so that, again, in the chapter I talk about, well, if we were thinking region instead of tribe, where would that lead us? Because it's Bashan, it's the place of the serpent, in the Old Testament. Talk a little bit about Gog and Armageddon. Again, Gog is the great enemy from the north. Okay, if you remember Unseen Realm, what is it about the north that's important? Saphon. It's the domain of Baal. Okay, that's not a coincidence. Again, to cast Gog in that language, and I do a little bit about. There's a reason I think why Gog has never been identified successfully with a historical person, either in antiquity or currently, because I think the point is not to direct our attention to a specific person, it's to direct our attention, again, to cosmic evil that will control whoever this Antichrist person is. And so I talk a little bit about that. And if you do that, again, you connect it back to Bashan, and then I go into connections between Gog and the Rephaim. Well, how in Gog are the Rephaim connected? Well, if Gog is coming from, the other parts of the earth, Saphon, and if the Antichrist guy is coming from the same place, that's also the region of the Rephaim, the giants. Again, you can do the math from the rest of that point. Again, it's not hard to connect the ideas once you get that point of geographical orientation. Cosmic north, region of Bashan geographically. And there are specific, again, links to the Titans and one particular Titan, Typhon. Again, there's a whole article on how Daniel 11 is sort of this chronology of the Antichrist that we get, how Daniel 11 tracks on the story of Typhon in Greek, literature, okay, or vice versa, depending on your view of the authorship of Daniel. Okay, there are a number of connections, and why that's important is because the figure of Daniel 11, historically, everybody, whether they think Daniel was written in the 6th century or the 2nd century, everybody agrees that the person who fulfilled all of these things in Daniel 11 already, and will, that'll echo out into a future prophecy, is who? Everybody remember the name? Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the Typhon figure in Greek literature. Again, if you're a literate Second Temple Jew, you're familiar with Hellenistic material, these are not coincidences. They all mean something. They're all part of a matrix of ideas. So it's a way to connect the Antichrist to another one of these Watcher, Titan, giant, supernatural bad guys. And so that's what I do in the chapter. Again, I'm just trying to show you in these 2 chapters how a Second Temple person who had knowledge of this material, how they would read Revelation. Not how Tim LaHaye reads it, okay? Or anybody else, Ritterboss or whoever. How would a Second Temple Jew read it? What thoughts would they think? What would pop out of their mouth in discussion if you had that guy in your small group study on Revelation? What he's going to be talking about is just going to frighten everybody else